All right, let us begin because time is short. And as we learned last week, there's so much to go through in each one of these chapters. And this chapter, chapter 2, is no exception. So we are going to talk about chapter 2 of Hebrews. Everybody get your worksheet for the discussion questions. I mean, as long as you get them before the discussion time, I guess that's the important thing. But they do show you where we're at. We are on week 3, which means we're doing chapter 2. Next week, we'll be doing chapter 3. Real easy to remember, and then after that it gets a little wonky where we're kind of doing more than one chapter because, well, we have to in order to get through the book before the end of the class period time. So, all right, so it's kind of fun because each week when I look through and I prepare the lesson, I have to figure out what I'm going to call each week. And this one was kind of a struggle because the whole first part of the book of Hebrews is all about, comparing Jesus to X. We saw comparing Jesus to the angels last week, for example. And we're going to launch next week into comparing Jesus to Moses, all right? But there's kind of this little interlude here in chapter 2. It's still kind of a hangover from comparing Jesus to the angels. There's still some of that in there, but it's also something, it's almost a little sidetrack. We're going to start just verse 1, right off the bat, okay? We must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. And this is the part I was telling you about. We're starting out with a warning. They're starting out this chapter after doing this whole comparison between Jesus and the angels. We're going to start out with a warning. And I want to start out with a question. All right, a question that's going to kind of help you get the author's point here. What happens, I've never done this, that I remember. What happens if you fall asleep on a boat, but that boat is not anchored to the sea floor? The boat hits another boat. Yeah, it's going to drift. I mean, even if there's not another boat on the sea, you're going to wake up and not see a light in the distance anywhere and not have any idea where you are, right? And that is, for those of you that aren't familiar, there's actually the theme verse and the theme of the school this year is anchored. It's about being anchored in Christ. And that actually comes from the book of Hebrews. We'll get to that verse later on when we work through it. And the idea being is that if you stay firmly anchored in his truth, if that is your guiding principle, and you stay there, and we'll talk about tonight, there's certain things you can do to make sure you stay fixed on Jesus, all right, then that's going to help prevent you from drifting away. The primary purpose here of this whole book is not just to teach us theology, all right? It does teach us theology, but that's all with an eye towards making sure and convincing and making an argument that Jesus is the superior way. The new covenant is superior to the old covenant, all right? So, when we look at this verse, for example, it says, we must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard. What's that? What is to what we have heard? What's the author referring to? The gospel. Right, exactly. That's the gospel. Because remember, that's the whole point. This is coming right after this whole conversation we had last week through chapter 1. All right? So the gospel message is what we have heard. So what I'm going to want you to do, excuse me, as we work through this, and I'm not going to ask you to answer this question right now, because it might be the first discussion question on your page for the end of the class. So I'm giving you fair warning to start thinking about it now, is to start thinking about the different ways that we drift away. Obviously, the context in the book of Hebrews was these people who had grown up in Old Testament Judaism now had probably lost a lot of their privilege, if you want to call it that, when they became Christians. Now they were more socially outcast and things like that. And so they were kind of feeling that temptation to go back to the old ways. Their temptation wasn't because there was anything objectively better about the old way. That's what the author here is talking about the whole time. It's just our own human frailties. There was a comfort there, all right? So with that general principle in mind, I want to ask you to start thinking about, okay, none of us have grown up in Old Testament Judaism. We're not feeling that particular pull, but what types of things do pull us? What types of things do maybe we think of that give us that affirmation from other people, from the world, as opposed to from God, that makes us feel good. And so that can be a temptation to drift away from his truth. Start thinking about that. Pick a verse. I learned this in my class. If I just do one verse at a time, and then, it takes forever for the kids, especially in 7th grade. They don't even know whether it's the Old Testament or New Testament, so they take forever to find the book. 20 minutes later, we're reading a single verse. So just a couple, if you can pick either Galatians 3:19 or Acts 7:53, so that when we get there, we can have somebody to read each of those. But here's what we see in verse 2 of chapter 2. It says, "For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment," and I'm deliberately breaking there. We're in the middle of a thought here, okay, which we're going to get to when we get to verse 3 for the rest of the thought, all right? But first we have to ask ourselves what the author is talking about by this message spoken through the angels. Somebody have Galatians 3:19 open to that? They could read that for us? Yeah.
Why then was the law given at all? It was added because of transgressions until the seed to whom the promise referred had come. The law was given through angels and entrusted to the mediator.
The law was given through angels. All right, what about Acts 7:53? The law that was put into effect through angels. Does anybody know when we talk about the law, when you see that come up in reference to the Old Covenant, what's that talking about? Like the 10 Commandments and the Levitical law, you basically have the 10 Commandments were these general principles. And then throughout Leviticus and everything, what you see is God kind of take those general principles and expands them to specific situations. And then, of course, what happens after that is that the Jewish authorities then expand and get to the point where Jesus says, y'all are nuts, right? This is way too much. You're putting too much of a burden on people. You're forgetting the spirit of the law. But yeah, that's what it was. The law is a way we refer to that old covenant, all right? The old way, the old system of doing things. And what you see in these verses, I'm sorry? Well, that's the thing. There was this Jewish tradition that in some way, shape, or form, God communicated through angels. So it wasn't that the angels were the ones deciding the law, but God, remember, angels are messengers. That's what it literally means. They are God's messengers. And so there was this Jewish tradition that the way God would deliver his message, not necessarily all the time, we see plenty of examples of him speaking directly, but when God would deliver his message, sometimes he would do it through angels. That was a common Jewish belief. How do we know it's a common Jewish belief? Because we see it in Scripture. We see it referred to that way. All right? And so when the author here is talking about the message spoken through angels, what he's doing is he's using a common Jewish understanding at the time to refer to the Old Testament law. All right? Just like we readily identified in the last verse when it was referring to the gospel, a first century Jewish person would readily identify this as referring to the Old Testament law. Okay? All right, so what they're saying here is, so the Old Testament law was binding. You had to follow it, okay? And if you didn't follow it, you deserved punishment. That's what the author's saying. The readers, he knows, the author of this is saying to the readers who already know this, look, you guys know, because you grew up in this system, that the law, the Old Testament, imposed certain expectations upon you. And if you didn't follow the rules, you deserved to be punished, which was the whole reason that they had to sacrifice to pay the price for their sins, because they earned punishment by violating God's law. All right? And you can see where this is building to. If the Old Covenant, if violated the Old Covenant deserved punishment, well, wouldn't rejecting the New Covenant also leave you deserving of punishment? I mean, especially since God said, even at the time of the Old Covenant, hey, I'm giving you a new one. Look out for it. It's coming. So you knew God's going to be doing this. So if you deserved punishment for rejecting the Old Covenant, why wouldn't you expect you're going to deserve punishment for rejecting the New Covenant? So don't reject the New Covenant. Again, this is that whole warning part of the chapter that we're seeing. That the author is warning them not to go back to the old ways, because yes, that is rejecting what God wants for you. No different, and matter of fact, even worse than you rejecting what God told you to do under the Old Covenant. All right? All right, then we get the rest of the thought when we get to verses 3 and 4. All right, so it says, if violating the old covenant deserved punishment, the author continues, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? All right, what is so great a salvation? What's that referring to? Jesus' death and resurrection, right? The new covenant, the new method of salvation, means of salvation that God told us to, through faith, by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. All right? Then he says, this salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Break it down. The first thing it says here is, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? How can you ignore? What kind of things do we do that are ignoring the gospel message? What do you think the author would be warning us against? Sin. I'm sorry? Following our own will. Disbelief. Take a look at Matthew chapter 13. We'll start in verse 18 and tell me if this passage looks familiar. It's a long chapter, and I'm on the wrong end of it. Here we go. Anybody know the parable of the sower? Remember that one? This is one of those times where Jesus said a parable but didn't explain it right away, and he came back later and explained what the meaning of the parable was. So, somebody want to read for us from verses 18 through 23. This is where Jesus is explaining what the meaning of the parable of the sower was. Yeah. What Jesus is doing in this parable is kind of trying to open our eyes to the many various different ways that we could ignore so great a salvation. Lots of times I think we try to oversimplify it. It's like, oh, it's just, somebody hearing the gospel and saying, nope, not for me. And what we tend to do as human beings, let's face it, is we always try to point the finger at them as opposed to at us. All right? I had in my 7th grade class, towards the beginning of the year, we were talking about salvation. And our first unit was on salvation. I can't remember the exact question I was asking them, but it was something about sin. And I was asking them to give examples. And after they did, every single example was correct. And I told them, every single thing you said was right. But I want you to notice something about the way all of you phrased it. Every single one of you used words like they and them, as opposed to we or us. Every single one, all right? Because that's kind of human nature. And so what Jesus does here is he's trying to kind of draw out that it's not that simple. There are multiple different ways that we could be ignoring the salvation. One of these talks, you get distracted, right? You get distracted by the things of this world, by the worries of this world, all right? And that can cause you to, in the words of the author of Hebrews, drift away. And that is just as much ignoring so great a salvation as someone who just flat out says, nope, not for me. All right? It's eye-opening when we really reflect on what this means. Now, moving on here, because we talked about that already. All right, we move on through this verse, and we did talk about this in week 1, this particular passage, where it says this was confirmed to us by those who heard him. All right? This is the line we looked at earlier that let us know that the author of Hebrews is what we call a second-generation Christian. All right? The author, this is also a reason why a lot of people don't think this is Paul, because they don't think Paul would have described himself this way. All right? He doesn't say it was confirmed to us by Jesus. You know, he says it was confirmed to us by those who heard Jesus. So there was Jesus' immediately disciples, and then there's this author, you know, kind of in the order of learning, of teaching. All right? Now, it does mean that part of the reason this is still could be considered scripture is because it wasn't Jesus and then the disciples and then the first century Christian to the second century Christian to the third and fourth, and then this author. All right? There was still, just like the Gospel of Mark, Mark is generally acknowledged to be a disciple of Peter. All right? So Mark wasn't one of Jesus' 12 disciples, but he was someone who learned directly from them. Same thing we see here. All right? Now, here is one of my favorite parts. And this is, I told you I'm an apologist, all right? A Christian apologist is someone who is prepared to give answers. So if I have someone who doesn't believe in Christianity, maybe they believe in some other worldview, some other religion, and they have some questions, they think the Trinity is a logical contradiction or something like that. They can come to me and I can have that discussion with them. Or maybe they just don't believe there's any evidence that God exists. I can have that conversation with them. That's what I do. But you'll notice there's an assumption in everything that I do, and that is there is evidence. Now, I'm not saying it's enough evidence to give you 100% certainty, of course not. But there is, frankly, I'd say there's never anything that gives you 100% certainty. You could be a brain in a jar on a shelf for all you know, okay? Now you're all going to have nightmares. But no, but the point is there is evidence. And what we see here, if we look at what the author of Hebrews says, the author of Hebrews is basically saying here, Ken's right. That's how I interpret the rest of this verse. It says that I am right. Because it says God also testified to it, the salvation, the gospel message, testified by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. All right? We don't need to go through all of these, but I'll tell you a couple here. If you look at these verses that I have down here, what you will notice about them is these are all instances where God has done a miracle. Exodus 7:5. Anything noting particular miracles God did in the book of Exodus? Part of the Red Sea. What were you going to say? The 10 plagues. Yeah. This is actually in reference to the 10 plagues. And what it says is, this is God getting ready to do them. Right? He's setting them up. He's talking to Moses, and he says, I'm going to do these so that the people of Egypt and Pharaoh will believe I am the one true God. All right? Miracles are not just magic tricks. They're not just things that God does because, oh my gosh, I got myself in trouble. I racked up a huge gambling debt. God, I need to win the lottery so I can pay it off. That ain't how he works. Sorry to disappoint anybody who went out and bought a lottery ticket. All right? He does miracles to provide evidence that some message that he's delivering is truly from him. Because if it wasn't from him, you couldn't do the miracle. All right? It's providing evidence. Same thing, if you look at John, why that's just one instance in John. But does anybody know how John refers to, he's picked certain miracles, and only certain miracles that he relays in his gospel, and he refers to them all the same way. Anybody know what that word is? Probably not. He refers to them all as signs. When John refers to a miracle, he doesn't call it a miracle, he calls it a sign. This was the first sign of Jesus. This was the second sign. What's a sign? It's something that's telling you something, right? That's the point. The miracle is not just for the sake of the miracle. The point of a miracle is to tell you something. Tell you what? Tell you that, yes, this message that I'm communicating to you really is from God. That's what Jesus was doing his miracles for. It was to validate his identity. I mean, this is the guy who literally came down and said, hi, I'm the Son of God. Oh, by the way, that means I am God. The Father and I, we're one, all that. Blasphemous, if it wasn't true. But of course it was true. And how do we know it was true? Because he provided the evidence to back it up. All right? That's how and this is exactly what the author of Hebrews is mentioning here as well. It says God testified to it. He testified to the gospel. He showed us the truth of the gospel. How? By giving signs, doing miracles, things like that to show that what he's telling us is true. We can trust it. It comes from God because only God could do these signs. All right? That's the point of them. That's the purpose of them. Christian faith is not blind faith. It never has been. All right? It never has been. Now, Let me give you an illustration of what I mean so we're not confused. The reason this is something near and dear to my heart is because a lot of atheists try to draw a caricature of Christianity, said it's just blind faith. You guys believe something even though there's no evidence for it. As a matter of fact, you believe something even though all the evidence is against it. No, we don't. All right? And the example I often give is when my son, who is now 15 years old and in the next room, don't tell him I was talking about him, he'll be mad at me. He's got that age right now. I'm not allowed to talk about him at all. All right? But when he was younger, he would stand on the steps in our house, and he would jump off the steps, and I would catch him, right? Well, he loved to do this. Well, one day, I'm standing there. You got to understand, the steps are behind, and the front door is here, and I'm looking out the front door, and all of a sudden I hear, "Daddy!" I turn around, and here's my kid already in midair jumping toward me, all right? Fortunately, I did catch him, all right? Now, he had faith that I would catch him, right? Another word you could use for Christian faith is trust, all right? When you're asked to have faith in Jesus, you're being asked to trust him with your life, all right? My son had faith that I would catch him. Was it blind faith? Did he have literally nothing to go on? Sure he did, because he'd done it a million times in the past, and I'd always caught him before. Does the fact that I'd always caught him before give 100% certainty I was going to catch him this time? No, but it was enough information to justify taking the leap, okay? That's what I mean by faith in a Christian sense is trust. It's not blind. God gives us enough information to back up that faith, all right? Not 100%. There's still an element of faith and trust in it, all right? But it does give you enough to back it up, all right? All right. Verse 5, we go on to see, it is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking, all right? And here we see kind of carry over from that first chapter. We're still drawing this contrast between the angels and Jesus, all right? And it's saying it is not to angels. So God has not subjected the world to come to angels. Who has he subjected the world to come to? Well, the world, first of all, what's the world to come? It's in the future, right? That to come means it's not here yet, all right? So here we're talking about the next creation, the next world, or when Jesus returns, all right? Who's going to be reigning at that point in time? If you don't remember, look back at chapter 1, verse 8, right here in Hebrews. Who's on the throne? Jesus is on the throne, right? Not the angels. Remember we talked last week that the Jewish people at the time, and we see a little bit more of that tonight, where they saw that God used the angels to deliver his messages, all right? So they held angels in very high regard. So we're seeing the author of Hebrews here basically show that even though you hold these angels in such high regard, you should hold Jesus in even higher regard. All right? Because even those angels are going to be subject to Jesus' rule. All right? So he is, like we saw before, higher than the angels. All right. And then I got 3 verses here altogether, because this is a quote from Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6. All right? And understand at the beginning, some people look at that first phrase where the author says, but there is a place where someone has testified, to think, well, does the author really not know where this is coming from? Well, the author provides a direct quote. It's a pretty good guess. So they probably know where it's coming from, or they wouldn't be able to provide the direct quote. It's actually just a Greek idiom at the time. You know, the point here is that he knows darn well that because he's talking to a Jewish audience, a Jewish Christian audience, that they know darn well where this comes from. All right? It's assumed. And we do that today in our culture sometimes too. We don't give unnecessary information. We know if we're talking to one audience, they already know what we're talking about. We're not going to give them a whole bunch of information they don't need to. It's a saying, basically. But there's a place where someone has testified, and then we get into the quote from Psalm 8, 4 through 6. What is mankind that you are mindful of? A son of man that you care for him. You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them. Now, here's where we have a little difference of opinion amongst the scholars as far as what this is referring to. All right? There is a majority view, though. And the reason we have this difference of opinion, has anybody ever heard that phrase, son of man, before? Who's it talking about? Not necessarily. Okay. It's one of those phrases that, yes, Sometimes Son of Man can be a messianic title referring to Jesus as the Messiah. And we do see some Old Testament prophecies that refers to Jesus as the coming Messiah as the Son of Man. All right? Son of Man can also sometimes be an expression referring to humanity. All right? Literally, son of humanity. You are a human person. All right? How do we distinguish the two? Well, it's called context. Context, context, context. All right? So that's where the difference of opinion comes. Some people look at this and say, well, this is referring to Jesus. The majority view, though, is, at least at this point, it's going to change in verse 9, but at this point, this is referring to humanity. All right? Why do we say that? Remember what I mentioned, I think it was in, I don't know, it was last week or the week before, one of those weeks. We said, whenever you see like a transition language, all right? Like at the beginning, guess what the first word of verse 9 is? But. It's but. All right? And so when you see that word, that kind of tells you there's a shift in focus, right? We were talking about one thing, now we're going to compare it or contrast it with something else. All right? And when you get into verse 9, as you'll see on the next slide, it's very obviously talking about Jesus. All right? Very clearly talking about Jesus. So if there was a shift in focus, that means this can't be talking about Jesus. So this must be Son of Man, speaking of humanity in general, talking about humanity in general, and then we're going to shift to but Jesus in the next verse. All right? So if we look at it from that perspective, what is this saying? All right? It says, what is mankind that you're mindful of them, humanity, a son of man, that you care for him? Why does God care about us? We are unworthy. That's essentially what the author is saying right here. We are sinners. All right? But God still, for some unknown reason, despite the fact that we don't deserve it at all, he cares about us. He honors us. He glorifies us. So much so that he has put everything under their feet. What's that referred to? Anybody ever heard the word stewardship? Yeah, it's one of those words we don't like because we think it's asking to give us money. And it can be. I'll be passing the collection plate around here momentarily. But stewardship, it basically means that you have been put in charge of something that belongs to someone else. All right? God made the entire world. All right? He made the entire universe. He made everything. It belongs to him. But he has given it in stewardship to humanity. All right? He has entrusted us with taking care of it. All right? He started doing this with Adam and Eve. And he didn't get past the first two humans before they messed it up. All right? Literally, what happens? They sin, they eat the fruit. Doesn't say it's an apple. Interesting little tidbit there. Just says a fruit. They eat the forbidden fruit. Everything falls. Humanity falls. Creation falls. If you go back and you look at that Genesis narrative, you'll see it's not just human nature that's fallen after that. It's all of creation. It talks about thorns growing up, and now you got to work the soil. All right? And so that is why we don't see we do not see everything subject to them right now. Why? Because the world has fallen. Because we messed it up. So under this perspective, what the author is talking about in these verses is God, even though we don't deserve it, God still honors us, so much so that he gave us stewardship of his entire creation, but we messed it up, which is why we don't see us really in charge of creation right now. Okay? But, yeah. But do we control the creation? And because that's the contrast. He's put everything under our command and under our stewardship, but we lost control of it because we sinned and we caused creation itself to fall, which is why we see things like hurricanes, like tornadoes, and other natural disasters. It doesn't say we are, because that's what we get into verse 9, but we do see Jesus. And it does say that essentially what this is saying, and we'll get into this more detail here in a second, but the contrast here is even though God put us in charge of everything and we messed it up, all right, and so that creation has gone all wonky and we can't control it. Jesus is going to step in. There's going to be a new heaven, a new earth. Jesus will be in control of it, and then we won't see things like hurricanes and natural disasters and things like that anymore. Creation will be subject to his control. So what we couldn't do, Jesus will do, and will do perfectly. All right? So we see here in verse 9, but, that's that contrast word, we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. All right? First of all, when was Jesus made a little lower than the angels? When he was born and became man, right? Exactly. It talks about him emptying himself. Doesn't mean he completely abandoned his divinity. He was still God, but he was in human form, all right? So he had to like walk places, and he had to eat and things like that. So he became a little lower than the angels at that point in time, all right? Jesus, and then it says but now he's crowned with glory. Why? Because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So as a result of him going through all of this, as a result of him sacrificing himself, he has now been elevated up to heaven. He's seated at the right hand of God. He's given glory as a result of what he did. That's going to be important here in a second. And he might taste death for everyone. Does that mean everyone is going to be saved? Well, you just said if. So if they believe, then does that mean everyone's going to be? Does everyone believe? No. And this is one of the things where you have to read the Bible in context. A lot of people will pick out a verse just like this and say, universalism, meaning everyone goes to heaven. Well, no, because everywhere else in the Bible it says that not everyone's going to go to heaven. All right, God would love that, but that just ain't going to happen. All right, and so what this is talking about, though, is we have Jesus who was God and also became man to sacrifice himself, and he lived a perfect life and was divine, was God, is God. And for that reason, his sacrifice was good enough for everyone. Doesn't mean it's going to be applied to everyone. Those are two different factors, all right? All right. And then we look in verse 10. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, who's that? That's us, yeah. Say it louder. You were right. Be proud. That was the right answer. That was us. That's right. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. All right? So how are we brought to glory through Christ? By his death and by us being able to be forgiven, right? That's how we get to spend eternity with God. All right, and the pioneer of their salvation, the pioneer of our salvation is Jesus, right? And here's where we get a confusing verse. All right, and this is why I was telling you before it was important to realize the distinction between, Jesus getting glorified because of what he did. All right? It says Jesus was through which he was made perfect through what he suffered. Well, wait a minute. I thought Jesus was God. Doesn't that mean he was perfect to begin with? Why did he have to be made perfect? Well, but he was still, but at the point, even when he was man, he still lived a perfect life. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to be our sacrifice. He did, and we're going to get to that at the end of this chapter. Actually, it's really one of the most powerful verses in Hebrews is coming up at the end of this chapter. But see, when we read this, we start thinking of being made perfect in the sense of an immoral sense. We immediately go to that. We say, well, he must have been made perfect. In other words, maybe he messed up before, but now he doesn't mess up anymore. But that's not what it's talking about. Remember, the whole context here is Jesus as a sacrifice, comparing the Old Testament system to the New Testament system, all right? And Jesus being a sacrifice under that. Somebody take a look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 5. And if somebody else wants to turn to that 1 Peter passage, nail them out both really quickly. Exodus is the second book of the Bible, by the way. Genesis, then Exodus. You got it? Go for it.
You choose must be 1-year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats.
All right, so this is talking about the animal that is chosen for the sacrifice to pay the price for the sins under the Old Covenant system. And it said to have to be a male what? But what, I heard somebody say it over. Without defect, right? Without defect. Now take a look at 1 Peter 1, 18 and 19. Yeah, go ahead.
Things such as silver or gold that you were being from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers. But with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect.
Oh, look at that.
It said but.
It said but. Very good. You got that. Absolutely. There was a contrast there, right? And it described Jesus as being a sacrifice, as a lamb without blemish or defect. It's drawing the parallel to the lamb, the sacrifice, or the animal that was sacrificed in the old covenant system, having to be perfect, all right, without blemish, all right. So what it's saying here is the whole point we're leading up to here is why did Jesus have to become human, okay? And we'll get to this in a minute, but as God, without becoming human, could he die? No, he had to become human to die. We'll see more about that in a second, right? And then, in order to be then a perfect sacrifice, could he sin while he was human? No, all right? So he had to live that sinless life to become the perfect sacrifice for us to pay the price for our sins, all right? So when it's talking about him being made perfect, it's talking about the process of him becoming that perfect sacrifice so that he could die on the cross. It's not saying Jesus sinned, all right? It's referring to this imagery we see about an animal without defect in Exodus and then applied to Jesus in 1 Peter. All right? And this is one of those things where context matters. Always remember who we're talking to here. We're talking to a Jewish audience. We're not talking to a 21st century Maryland, United States of America audience, all right? People love to do that. They put their modern assumption and presuppositions on the text rather than asking what would the original audience have interpreted this to mean, all right? And that's what we always need to be asking ourselves. All right, verse 11. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. Who's the one who makes people holy? Who's the ones who are made holy? Us, right? Of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. To be holy, what that word means, it means to be set apart, and specifically to be set apart for God, for service to God. So when you see things described in the old tabernacle and temple being made holy, being considered holy, that means those particular articles, that lampstand, whatever it may be, was specifically set apart for service to God. You couldn't take the lampstand out of the temple and then go use it to read a book by in your recliner later that night. That wasn't the point. It was a lampstand that was specifically set apart for service to God. All right? Same thing with us. We are set apart for service to God. Set apart from what? Set apart from the rest of the world. Right? That's what we're supposed to be. All right? Now that has two kind of senses. One, when we come to faith in Jesus, all right, we are declared righteous. I give the example sometimes, if God was looking at you and he was judging you based upon your acts, what's he going to see? But he's going to see some bad stuff in there, right? Now imagine instead that Jesus steps in between the two of you, all right? And so now God is judging you, but he's judging you by what he sees in Jesus. Is he going to see any of that bad stuff anymore?
Rose-colored glasses.
Rose-colored glasses, right? And so you are then declared righteous even though you've sinned. All right, so that's the first sense of this. But it's more than that. God does more than that. Once we come to faith, he then also does work through the Holy Spirit to make us more and more like Christ. And that's how I always say, my motto is I always try to look at myself this year compared to where I was at the same time last year and ask, am I becoming more like Christ? Am I in a different place this year than I was last year? If not, I need to do some serious soul searching and probably get into the scriptures more and and address my relationship with God more. Because God does tell us that that's what he's going to do throughout our lives. All right? All right. And so we are all members of the same family. All right? So now, people misinterpret things like this too. You'll hear lots of people say, well, we're all God's children. Well, yes and no. I mean, we're all God's children in the sense that did God make us all? Are we all made in God's image? Sure. Does that mean everybody's going to heaven? No. all right? But that's the parallel people make. They say, well, we're all God's children. See, it says we're all part of his family. Well, hold on a second. It says those people, those who make people holy, and those who are made holy. It doesn't say everyone, okay, is part of the same family. This isn't talking about being part of the same family in the sense that, well, we're all made in God's image. He made us all. This is talking about a closer, more intimate relationship than that. Something that comes from having faith and from declaring Jesus as your Lord and dedicating your life to serving him, all right? We're running out of time, so I'm not going to go through this, but this is, if you ever want to look at it later, this is kind of a neat contrast. If you look at Luke chapter 9, verse 26, that's when Jesus is talking about, you know, being ashamed of people. And of course, here, what's he saying? He's saying he's not ashamed, all right? And so it's a neat little contrast. You want to look at it later on between Jesus talking about being ashamed of people in the next life versus not being ashamed. All right. And then we get on to verse 12. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters in your assembly, or in the assembly, I will sing your praises. This is kind of neat, and I do want, while I'm leading this up, I want somebody to open up to Psalm 22, all right? This is where this passage comes from. Now, this comes from verse 22, further down in the psalm, all right, specifically. And these are words in the psalm that are originally spoken about God. This is someone saying, I'm going to declare your name, God's name, to my brothers and sisters, all right? But if you look in context, what the author of Hebrews is doing here, he's basically saying Jesus is speaking these same words about us, all right, saying he's proud of us. He's going to declare our name in the assembly, which, by the way, just kind of neat. Remember, this author quotes from the Greek version of the Old Testament, Septuagint. That word for assembly in the Greek is ecclesia, which is also what's translated in the New Testament as church. Just kind of neat. I'm not saying it means anything at all, but it's kind of neat. Now, so this comes from Psalm 22:22, which the author is using to say, hey, look, after we come to faith, Jesus is so proud of us. And he's declaring to the whole world, he's singing our praises, all right? Somebody read to me verse 1 of that same psalm. Psalm 22, verse 1. What's it say? Sound familiar at all? Where have you heard that before? On the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Those are Jesus' words on the cross. And what I just think is beautiful about what the author of Hebrews is doing here is he's taking this psalm, all right, that starts with this imagery and evokes images of Jesus on the cross and ends, at least in verse 22, with Jesus singing the praises of those who have come to have faith in him.
That's the hardest thing to explain
Mm-hmm.
in the whole Bible.
What's that?
Is Jesus being on the cross. It makes it seem like there's two different, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Well, what Jesus is doing there, is he's actually, I mean, there's a couple things going on in that moment, all right? Jesus is very deliberately quoting this psalm. It's not a coincidence. Why? Possibly for the same reason the author of Hebrews is using it here, because he's not going to sit there on the cross, you know, and recite the entire psalm, okay? But he's referring his listeners to it so that they will read it and see where it leads to, all right? It does have a happy ending, so to speak, in the end. But at the same time, he is also using it to indicate the fact that, yes, God hates sin. And at that point in time, Jesus is taking all of the world's sin upon himself to pay that price for us. And so it's also being used, Jesus is also using the psalm to evoke that imagery so people understand what's going on here. That it's that moment that he's taking everything we've ever done, he's taking on himself because he loves us that much. All right?
I've got just one little question.
Sure.
So, would it be safe to say then that when he says, why have you forsaken me, it's not that he actually feels like, hey God, you just let me hang here, but he knew it was going to happen and now he's done what he was sent there to do and
I think he's communicating that he's feeling the weight of our sin upon him. It's clearly not any kind of lack of understanding of what's happening, because we saw him go through this discussion with the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. So he clearly knew what was about to happen to him. He didn't want it to happen, would any of you? Okay, but he was willing to do it. You know, because that was the Father's will. Yeah. All right, verse 13, and again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here am I, the children God has given me. Now what we're doing, the author is quoting from Isaiah chapter 8, verses 17 through 18. What's really neat about this, and you see that the author of Hebrews picking these verses out, I think, very deliberately, because in Isaiah 8:11, right before these verses, look at what it says. It says, this is what the Lord says to me with his strong hand upon me, warning me not to follow the ways of this people. Doesn't that sound awful like the message here in Hebrews? I mean, it's that warning not to be sucked in, not to be distracted. We see that same thing in these verses in Isaiah, all right? But again, what we have here is words that were originally spoken by Isaiah of God, but here the author of Hebrews is putting them in the mouth of Jesus, and this time it's Jesus talking about the Father and putting his trust in the Father, okay? I will put my trust in him. This is Jesus. He said, this is Jesus saying, I'm going to put my trust in the Father, all right? And again, here I am and the children God has given me, the children being and again, Luke 22:42, sometimes these things come full circle. What's that? Garden of Gethsemane. All right? That's Jesus putting his trust in the Father. All right? All right. Verse 14. And this is what we already talked about, touched on before. Since the children have flesh and blood. Who's that? Us, right? He too, Jesus, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the devil. All right. Jesus, in order to be a sacrifice, had to die. Can he do that without becoming human? No. That's the point. If he's going to die for us, he had to become human first. But in order to reassure us that death had been overcome, all right, he also had to come back to life. And in order to do that, he needed to be God. All right, so you see where he needed to be both in order to accomplish this victory over the power of death. It does speak of the devil really quickly because I know we're running short on time. Why does it say the devil holds the power of death? Well, who is Satan? All right, Satan is our accuser. He's the tempter. He was the one saying, hey, this fruit looks good, right, in the Garden of Eden. All right, and if you look at Romans 6, verse 23, anybody off the top of your head know what that says? If I were to tell you the first two words are the wages. There you go. See? Yeah. The wages of sin is death, right? So there's a direct connection between sin and death. Why is death in the world? Because of sin. All right? Who is the one that's accusing us, that's tempting us? That's Satan. All right? So there's a direct connection between Satan tempting us, we give in to it, we sin, that's why we die. Okay? All right. 15. And free those who all of their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. This is one of those powerful messages that I want you to reflect on, too. It's not one of the discussion questions, but it can be if you want it to be. All right? How often do we get preoccupied with the fear of physical death? I mean, think about the things we do in this world. Not even necessarily that we would necessarily think directly connected to that. But, you know, watch TV. How many makeup ads do you see, you know, that make yourself look, you know, that I'll get rid of all the wrinkles, you know. Here, men, you want to grow your hair back? You know, I mean, we have all of these things that are out there that are designed to help make us feel younger. Why? Because we have this inherent fear of death. I wasn't trying to take a pot shot at you, by the way, if that's what you thought. Okay. Clearly, you don't have that fear. All right. But you see, if we truly embrace the fact that the physical death of this life is really just a doorway to a better eternal life the next, then we don't have to fear that anymore, do we? All right? Mm. Right. I think it depends on who you talk to. I would agree with you because even I have that fear of going through that door. You know, you don't want, but if you don't have hope that there's something on the other side of that door, then it's more than just the process, because now all of a sudden you're talking about this is the end of my existence. There's no hope for anything beyond that. And I know some people that have some fear of that have gotten terrified of the darkness, of the lights going out, so to speak. And that's part of what the hope that we have to offer them, you know.
Well, and just as an add-on to that, there are people who right now are going through horrible things with a family member, and as bad as it is for that person in the condition they're in, the parents are praying that God will keep him alive long enough to finally come to Jesus.
To come to faith, to have faith, yeah.
And
Yeah.
so for them, to them, death is walking from room into a much better place.
Mm-hmm.
But for this person, he can't see that.
Well, and that's also why I never get in the business of, saying, well, does so-and-so go to heaven or not? Because I don't know. I mean, we see, you look at the thief on the cross, and we get enough evidence right there alone that it can be, God can give faith to someone at the last minute if he wants to. He's God. He can do whatever he wants. Yeah. And so you never know. You never know what's going through. That thief, if anybody that knew that thief in life would never believe in a million years that thief was spending eternity with God. Guess what? Still happened, right? All right. Three short verses left here. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants, meaning God. Again, we see that contrast. Who are Abraham's descendants? Us. Galatians 3:29 is that verse where Jesus says, God can make descendants for Abraham out of anybody he wants to. Okay? Because the Jews would hear Abraham's descendants and think that means Abraham's biological descendants, the Jewish people. And Jesus was saying, God can do that for anybody. Just because you're Abraham's descendant doesn't mean you're somehow better or superior to everybody else. You just happen to be of the people that God chose to bring this plan into creation, into existence through. It doesn't mean you're better than everybody else. God can make anybody Abraham's descendants, and in fact, he has. Spiritual descendants of Abraham. All right, for this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. We talked about this more in chapter 1, that Jesus is serving dual roles here, more than dual roles. We also talked about king a little bit, but here specifically, understand, Jesus is both the high priest, who's going to make the sacrifice for us, and he is the sacrifice himself. All right. So under the old covenant system, we saw all these different people filling separate roles because no one could really do the whole job that Jesus was going to do, right? To illustrate certain aspects of what this perfect sacrifice was going to be. And the author of Hebrews is talking about the fact that Jesus is doing both. The work of the priest, the high priest would go into the temple, into the most holy place, and offer the sacrifice once a year on Yom Kippur, which, by the way, is next week, if anybody didn't know that. It's coming up, good, timely thing. People would still make sacrifices throughout the year, but there was this one catch-all kind of sacrifice that would happen every year. All right? All right. And then the last verse, because this is the discussion question, so I want to make sure we got to this, because this is powerful. This is powerful stuff. All right? Verse 18. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Understand, Jesus became human, not just because he had to in order to die, but because it gives us reassurance. All right? I taught a class last year about the problem of evil and suffering and pain. And in the very first chapter, I wrote a book for that for my degree. And the first chapter of the book dealt with this partially. It dealt with the fact that unlike any other world religion out there, we have a God that can relate to us. We have a God who literally came down and lived among us. He felt what it was like to have Satan come and try to tempt him to do something wrong, right? He felt what it was like to be betrayed by his closest friends. He felt what it was like to lose his closest friends to death. He felt what it was like to have excruciating pain and suffering, all right? To be rejected by his family. He felt all of that. And so we know that when we are praying to God, when we are asking for comfort, we're not speaking to a God who has no idea what we're talking about, who can't relate to us at all. We're talking to a God who can because he literally has been there, all right? And that's something else we want to reflect upon because we are going to have that as one of our discussion questions as well.